February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima, Volcano Islands. The black volcanic sand trembled under the weight of the tanks. Marine engineers had only cleared a narrow path through the beach obstacles when the first Japanese shells struck, sending geysers of grit skyward. In the chaos, a low, rumbling silhouette moved forward. A Sherman tank, its hull coated in soot. A thick hose coiled along its flank like a serpent. The crew inside could barely hear over the roar of the engine. The gunner's hand hovered. Above, a brass trigger linked to a steel nozzle jutting from the bow. Ahead, a concrete bunker spat machine gun fire. Inside, Imperial Japanese infantry crouched behind steel doors, certain the fortress would hold. They had poured months into these defenses, concrete layered 4 feet thick, entrances concealed and sealed against grenades. Then came a hiss, followed by a thunderclap that split the air. A jet of flame 40 yards long engulfed the embrasure. Fire raced over the bunker's face, finding every crack, every vent. In seconds, the structure glowed red, its defenses melting like wax. Through the drifting smoke, Marines advanced, silent and grim. For the first time, Japanese soldiers realized the truth. Even concrete could burn. By the opening months of 1945, the Pacific War had entered its final, most brutal phase. The island of Iwo Jima, a speck of volcanic rock halfway between the Marianas and Japan, had become the hinge of America's plan to bring the war to the enemy's doorstep. From the island's twin airfields, Japanese radar posts guided interceptors that tore into the long-range B-29 bombers headed for Tokyo. To the Joint Chiefs, it was simple arithmetic: capture Iwo Jima, and the bombing campaign could operate under American air cover all the way to Honshu. Yet on that same island, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had turned geology into strategy. Rather than meeting the invaders on the beaches, he ordered his garrisons to disappear underground, into a honeycomb of 7 miles of tunnels and over 1,500 reinforced concrete bunkers. Each was poured from volcanic ash mixed with coral and cement, an alloy so dense that ordinary artillery shells shattered against it like pebbles on iron. The Japanese believed their fortifications could withstand anything short of direct naval bombardment. Inside, infantrymen slept beside machine gun nests and mortar positions, convinced that these gray casemates were impregnable. For U.S. forces, such belief had already proven deadly on Saipan and Tarawa. Marines learned that grenades and small arms, fire could not clear a bunker whose gun ports remained sealed. Flamethrowers, portable and terrifying, had appeared in the hands of infantry assault teams, but their limited range of 40 feet and fragile fuel tanks left operators exposed and often dead within minutes. The solution came not from infantry doctrine, but from engineers. If a man carrying a flamethrower was too vulnerable, then perhaps a machine could carry the flame instead. In the summer of 1944, American engineers in Hawaii and the Marianas experimented with adapting the M4 Sherman tank into a flame projector. Using pressurized napalm gel stored in internal tanks and propelled by compressed nitrogen, the new system could hurl fire over 150 yards, 4 times farther than a man-portable unit. Each burst lasted only a few seconds, but the effect was total. Concrete spalled, steel fittings buckled, and the oxygen inside bunkers vanished in a flash. The Pacific Ocean Area's Chemical Warfare Service and Marine engineers nicknamed their creation the CWSPOA flame tank, though troops simply called it the Crocodile, after its British cousin that had terrified German positions in Normandy. As invasion planners studied aerial photos of Iwo Jima's tunnels and pillboxes, they realized that no amount of naval gunfire could neutralize what lay beneath. They would have to burn it out. When the assault force of the 5th Amphibious Corps assembled in Saipan harbors in January 1945, 24 of the new flame tanks rolled onto landing craft, their nozzles gleaming like torch mouths. Few of the Marines yet understood what these machines could do. Fewer still imagined how their arrival would rewrite the psychology of war beneath the Pacific sun. When Kuribayashi's lookouts spotted the armada on the horizon, they believed their fortresses would hold for weeks. They did not know that among the Shermans and tractors grinding toward the beach were engines designed not to breach walls with steel, but to consume them with fire. The Japanese called their bunkers the teeth of the island. Soon those teeth would melt. In the weeks before the invasion, Allied intelligence pored over every aerial photograph and captured map of Iwo Jima's defenses. The island's interior was a fortress disguised as landscape. Concrete bunkers were buried beneath volcanic ridges. Interlocking tunnels allowed troops to vanish and reappear without warning. It was not a battlefield. It was an underground city built to kill invaders. U.S. planners estimated that even with overwhelming naval firepower, many of those positions would survive. What they needed was a weapon that could reach into a bunker and erase what lay inside. At Pearl Harbor and Guam, Marine engineers and chemical warfare service technicians modified Shermans day and night. Each tank's main gun was replaced with a coaxial projector capable of spraying a stream of jellied gasoline nearly the length of a football field. 2 massive fuel cylinders filled the hull space where ammunition once sat, and a nitrogen pressurization system forced the flaming liquid outward with terrifying velocity. Tests on derelict pillboxes showed results beyond expectation. Steel melted, concrete fractured, and interior temperatures soared above 1,000 degrees Celsius. The project was codenamed POA CWS 75H1, a technical label that would soon earn a simpler reputation among troops: Hell on Tracks. When the landing on February 19th began, naval gunfire from battleships Nevada and Texas pounded Mount Suribachi for 3 consecutive days. Yet when the first waves of Marines came ashore, they found machine gun ports still firing from blackened ridges. The bombardment had scorched the surface but spared the subterranean defenses. Commanders quickly called for the flame Shermans. By the 3rd day, engineers had welded spare armor plates onto the tanks and tested the delicate hoses that ran from internal reservoirs to the nozzles. Every crewman knew the risk. One lucky mortar hit could ignite the entire vehicle, but they went forward regardless. On the Japanese side, disbelief turned to dread as reports arrived over field telephones. Our bunkers are burning. The concrete is burning. Kuribayashi at first dismissed the claim as panic. He had seen flamethrowers before and knew their limitations. But his officers insisted that entire strongpoints were collapsing under jets of liquid fire that pierced even sealed embrasures. At Nishi Ridge and Airfield No. 1, flame tanks advanced in pairs, each spraying alternately while the other reloaded. In the dim light of the tunnels, the reflections looked like the gates of a furnace opening and closing. American correspondents embedded with the Marines later described the strange mixture of horror and efficiency. One wrote, "It was the cleanest form of destruction imaginable. No debris, no rubble, only fire." Engineers treated each bunker as a technical challenge rather than a target. Calculate angle, distance, pressure, and fuel mix. Then fire. The psychological effect proved greater than any explosive. Japanese soldiers who had sworn to fight to the death began abandoning positions, crawling through vents to escape suffocation and heat. The myth of the indestructible bunker died in a single afternoon. By the end of the first week, word spread across the island that the Americans possessed tanks that could melt rock. To the defenders, it seemed as if science itself had joined the invasion. For U.S. commanders, the success validated a doctrine of engineering over brute force. When faced with the immovable, invent something that makes movement irrelevant. The stage was set for the coming chapters of the Pacific Campaign, Okinawa, Peleliu, and beyond, where the marriage of technology and determination would define the closing act of the war. And at its heart stood a weapon born not from hatred, but from the relentless logic of problem-solving under fire. The story of America's flamethrower tanks on Iwo Jima was not only about fire and steel, it was a demonstration of how engineering precision could alter the very psychology of warfare. Each angle of this innovation revealed a new layer of transformation: technical, tactical, and human. The M4 Sherman had always been the workhorse of Allied armor, reliable, standardized, and endlessly modifiable. When U.S. engineers converted it into a flame tank, they did not invent a new machine. They reimagined an old one for a different kind of war. The Pacific's terrain and soft coral, volcanic slopes, humid jungles punished equipment in ways Europe never did. Conventional tanks bogged down, flamethrower troops died before closing range, and explosives often bounced off fortified caves. The answer lay in combining protection, range, and terror into one chassis. The key innovation was the pressurized delivery system. By mixing gasoline with napalm powder and forcing it out with nitrogen, the engineers created a controllable jet that could cling to surfaces and burn at over 800 degrees. A tank could project 5-second bursts, each consuming roughly 150 gallons of fuel, enough to sterilize an entire bunker. Early models leaked or exploded under pressure, but the Hawaii-based CBs refined every valve and gauge until the design could be field-serviced in minutes. It was mass-produced logic applied to Terror's toolset. To the Marines, the flame tank changed the geometry of battle. Instead of frontal assaults against bunker apertures, units advanced in coordinated fire sweeps. Riflemen would fix Japanese defenders behind their embrasures while tanks sprayed the vents, doors, and firing slits. Each burst created a vacuum as oxygen vanished, collapsing air pressure inside the bunker and killing everyone within seconds. Reports later described Japanese soldiers found without burns, suffocated by heat alone. Tactically, this meant speed. Where a normal assault might take 2 hours of grenades and small arms fire, a flame tank could clear a strongpoint in under 10 minutes. Marine commanders began assigning flame Shermans to bunker buster teams, supported by engineers carrying demolition charges. On Iwo Jima's sulfur plains, these units moved in a deadly rhythm: fire, silence, advance. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. Japanese garrisons fled tunnels that had once symbolized safety, while American infantry found themselves advancing through landscapes glowing with residual heat. For the Japanese defenders who had been trained to value courage above all, the flamethrower represented something inhuman, a weapon that denied even the dignity of battle. Their manuals had prepared them for bombs, bullets, and bayonets, but not for fire that crawled over concrete and chased them underground. Survivors later wrote that they could hear the tanks coming before they saw them. The metallic hiss of nitrogen pumps, the slosh of fuel, then the crack as flame ignited. Entire platoons abandoned positions rather than face what they called the dragon's breath. Among the Americans, reactions were more complex. Many Marines saw the flame tanks as necessary tools, born from bitter experience on Tarawa and Peleliu. Others felt unease at what they witnessed. The sight of bunkers burning for hours left some shaken. Chaplains later noted that confessions after such missions doubled. Yet the pragmatic mindset of the Corps prevailed. If this horror shortened the war, it was justified. That grim calculus echoed through every report written on the island. Commanders debated the morality of flame weapons. General Holland Smith, who oversaw the Iwo Jima operation, wrote that, "The flamethrower is perhaps the most effective and the most feared weapon in our arsenal." Yet even he admitted its use carried a moral weight not easily forgotten. In the years following, engineers would note that the same system which delivered death inside bunkers was later adapted for civilian use, clearing brush, sterilizing soil, even controlling pests. It was a bitter symmetry, technology without emotion, its purpose shaped only by the hands that held it. The first week of combat proved the weapon's value beyond doubt. As tank crews refined their tactics, entire Japanese strongholds evaporated from the maps. Reports from forward observers recorded the phrase, "position neutralized by flame," so often that typists began using a shorthand. Within the larger narrative of the Pacific War, the flamethrower tank stood as both marvel and warning, proof of what happens when ingenuity meets desperation. If the flamethrower tank proved anything on Iwo Jima, it was that warfare in the Pacific had become an engineer's war as much as a soldier's. Every engagement between bunkers and tanks revealed deeper layers of adaptation on both sides, each driven by observation, logic, and necessity. Japanese officers quickly began experimenting with countermeasures. They poured seawater into defensive trenches to absorb the flames, coated tunnel entrances with sandbags soaked in mud, and installed blast doors that could be slammed shut when tanks approached. Some even attempted to construct double-chambered bunkers, the outer room designed to absorb fire while the inner stayed sealed. But these were desperate improvisations against a weapon conceived with industrial precision. The pressure of the American flamethrowers made water boil away in seconds, while the sheer heat warped steel doors like wax. Reports from Japanese engineers recorded the failure bluntly. The flame cannot be stopped by any obstacle less than 1 meter thick. By the time those lessons reached Tokyo, the island was already lost. The Americans, meanwhile, refined their machines in real time. Crews swapped hoses mid-battle, adjusted nitrogen valves to change the flame's reach, and even used bursts of fire to ignite smoke screens that hid advancing infantry. What began as a specialized tool turned into an integrated tactic, proof that invention could evolve faster than an opponent's defense. The men who operated the flamethrower Shermans were not ordinary tankers. Each belonged to a small, tight-knit team that lived with the knowledge that their vehicle could become an inferno with a single hit. They often drove with hatches open despite the danger, fearing suffocation more than shrapnel. Their names rarely appeared in newspapers, but to the Marines slogging through the sands, these flame boys were saviors. When a bunker refused to die, someone would radio, "Bring the fire tank." Within minutes, a low hum and the smell of fuel announced its arrival, followed by silence because the screams that followed were indescribable. Even Japanese survivors later spoke of those tanks with a kind of grim respect. One lieutenant captured at Iwo Jima's northern ridge said during interrogation, "The flame tanks were the end. We could fight men but not fire. It was an admission not of weakness but of acknowledgement. The enemy had turned technology into something elemental." The success of flamethrower tanks transformed Allied assault planning. In later Pacific operations, Okinawa, Luzon, and even the planned invasion of Kyushu, Army and Marine Corps field manuals listed flame tank integration as a standard procedure for breaching fortified zones. Commanders paired them with bulldozers and demolition teams, creating a new triad of assault engineering. The effect went beyond tactics. It rewrote how the U.S. military thought about adaptation. Every obstacle, geographic or mechanical, was treated as an engineering problem to be solved, not a reason to halt. At a broader level, these machines symbolized the collision between industrial capability and the human spirit. Japan's defenses relied on courage and endurance. America's strength lay in replication, fuel supply, and mechanical imagination. When the two met in the black sands of Iwo Jima, courage alone could no longer compete. In post-war years, Japanese historians reflected on how this shift shattered the nation's martial ethos. Samurai ideals had once defined the Japanese soldier: discipline, honor, and the willingness to die for the emperor. But against American mechanization, those virtues seemed archaic. The flamethrower tank was a symbol of modernity's cold arithmetic. One machine could accomplish what 100 men could not. To a generation raised on the belief that spirit could overcome steel, it was a revelation that the industrial age had erased that balance forever. In America, newsreels sanitized the weapon's horror. Viewers saw plumes of flame followed by cheering Marines, never the charred interiors or the silence that followed. The public perceived efficiency. The soldiers remembered fire that lingered long after victory. By the war's end, over 350 flame tanks had been deployed across the Pacific. Their designs influenced later generations of combat engineering vehicles, from Vietnam's M132 Zippo to modern fuel-air systems. But beyond hardware, they left a lasting lesson: that innovation is neither moral nor immoral, only useful. The same knowledge that allowed Americans to build hospitals in weeks also created machines capable of burning mountains. For better or worse, it marked the point where the battlefield became an industrial experiment, conducted in real time. By the time the smoke cleared over Iwo Jima, nothing remained of the once celebrated Japanese fortifications but ash and warped rebar. The Marines moved on. The engineers took notes, and the world quietly crossed another threshold in the mechanization of war. March 1, 1945, North Slope, Iwo Jima. The morning began with a silence so heavy it felt rehearsed. From the sea, destroyers floated motionless against a gray horizon. On land, Marines crouched in craters that still steamed from last night's bombardment. Then through the haze came the tanks. 6 Shermans fitted with flamethrowers rolled forward in line abreast, their turrets already turning as if sniffing for targets. For the Japanese inside the northern ridges, this was the moment when confidence finally fractured. The defenses they had spent months carving into the rock were about to be tested by fire in its purest, engineered form. Each tank carried roughly 450 gallons of thickened gasoline. The men inside could hear it sloshing behind steel plates as they climbed the slope. On the lead vehicle, Sergeant Joseph LaPlante's hand rested over the ignition switch. His gunner kept his eyes fixed on the faint square of a bunker ahead. "Range 100 yards, he whispered. The hiss of pressurized nitrogen filled the hull, and the next sound was a deep, percussive whoomp. A river of fire leapt from the nozzle, struck the bunker's aperture, and blossomed into orange-white heat that devoured everything within seconds. Observers noted that the flame burned so hot it created a vacuum. The blast pulled air and dust back toward the tank in a reverse wind. It was the first coordinated use of flamethrower tanks against a networked cave system. Marine engineers had plotted each bunker on aerial photographs, assigning a tank to every target. Infantry followed close behind, advancing through corridors of smoke and scorched sand. When one tank's fuel was depleted, another took its place, keeping a continuous wall of fire moving northward. From a distance, the operation looked almost mechanical, one machine exhausting its cycle while the next began. But inside those bunkers, the experience was apocalyptic. Japanese Captain Shigeto Tanaka, commanding the 310th Independent Infantry Battalion, recorded in his diary moments before his position fell. "The tunnels have become our tombs. The air burns, the concrete glows." That diary was found later, charred but legible inside a melted canteen pouch. Its words captured what Allied after-action reports would describe clinically as psychological collapse of the enemy garrison. For the first time, Japanese defenders abandoned fully stocked bunkers without orders. They ran toward the cliffs rather than face what they now called the Dragon tanks. At headquarters, General Kuribayashi received the reports with disbelief. He had been an artilleryman his entire career and respected engineering. He understood bridges, tunnels, concrete, but he could not fathom a weapon that turned those things into liabilities. He ordered counterattacks at night, hoping to strike when the tanks were refueling, yet even darkness offered no safety. The Marines parked their vehicles behind ridges, using the island's own craters as fuel pits. The next morning they returned, flames roaring brighter than before. One sequence near the Motoyama airfield became legendary among observers. A group of Japanese gunners opened fire from a line of pillboxes. Two flame tanks advanced side by side, rotating their nozzles like searchlights. When the first jet of napalm struck, the fire followed the trench system underground, consuming oxygen as it traveled. Within a minute, secondary explosions from ammunition stores ripped through the ridge. A Navy cameraman filmed the entire event from a distance of 200 yards. The footage would later appear in training reels under the caption, "Demonstration of complete fortification elimination." For the men inside the tanks, victory felt strangely detached. They saw the flames, felt the concussions, but rarely the enemy. Gunner Robert Duncan later said, "It was like fighting ghosts. You pressed a button and the ghosts disappeared." That mechanical detachment defined this new phase of war. Technology had created a distance between cause and effect so vast that the mind struggled to comprehend it. Every jet of flame that poured from a Sherman represented not rage or vengeance, but procedure. Fuel pressure 300 psi, burst 5 seconds. Sweep left. It was industrial killing executed with laboratory precision. By the end of that day, the northern ridge that had stalled the invasion for a week was gone. U.S. commanders estimated over 1,000 Japanese casualties, most sealed within collapsed tunnels. American losses were minimal: 3 tanks damaged, 2 men wounded. In a war where beaches had once been painted red, this efficiency felt almost supernatural. Reporters described the site as the island itself exhaling fire. For the first time, commanders realized that such tactics could reshape the tempo of every future amphibious assault. Yet even amid triumph, unease lingered. Marine Colonel Liversedge wrote in his diary that night, "The day was ours, but the smell of it will stay forever." The stench of burned fuel and flesh drifted over the island for days, a reminder that progress often carried its own form of horror. When news of the success reached fleet headquarters aboard USS El Dorado, staff officers applauded quietly. They had just witnessed proof that a single innovation could undo months of enemy preparation. But the mood was not celebratory. It was analytical. How fast could these tanks be shipped to Okinawa? How many could the Navy deliver? The weapon's effectiveness meant it would spread, and with it the moral weight of what it did. The climax of Iwo Jima's mechanized inferno marked a turning point not only for the island, but for modern warfare itself. Technology had replaced attrition with annihilation by design, and for the Japanese commanders who watched their concrete bastions dissolve under fire, It marked the moment when faith in fortification died, and the age of mechanical dominance began. As March 1945 unfolded, the sound of flamethrower tanks became as familiar on Iwo Jima as the ocean's surf. The Marines advanced yard by yard, each wave of fire reshaping the island's landscape. But what made this phase extraordinary was not simply destruction. It was the transformation of combat psychology. The Japanese army, once the embodiment of defiance, was now unraveling under the continuous roar of liquid fire. By mid-March, American commanders launched Operation Detonation Ridge, the final effort to clear the remaining tunnel systems beneath Mount Suribachi's northern slopes. Intelligence estimated that over 3,000 Japanese soldiers remained hidden within a labyrinth stretching nearly 6 miles underground. The entrances were invisible to aircraft and nearly impervious to artillery. For weeks, bombardment had done little but collapse side chambers, forcing defenders deeper. The solution was simple and horrifying: drive them out with heat. At dawn on March 10th, the assault began. 10 flame tanks rolled forward in pairs, escorted by bulldozers that pushed earth over their treads to protect against mines. Engineers had learned from earlier fights that the secret to breaking the tunnels was not to burn them once, but to sustain pressure, keeping the temperature high enough to suffocate anyone inside. Each tank fired a 5-second burst, then another, until the air itself shimmered like molten glass. Japanese Sergeant Masanobu Kida, one of the few survivors, later told interrogators, "It was not war, it was the end of air." He described how men tore off uniforms, dug barehanded at tunnel walls, and screamed as oxygen vanished. Some shot themselves. Others simply lay down and never rose again. For the first time in the Pacific, the Imperial Army's discipline disintegrated not through defeat in battle, but through the sheer impossibility of continuing to breathe. From the American command posts, observers tracked progress through plumes of black smoke. Marine spotters used mirrors and flags to signal when a bunker was clear. The field radio chatter was chillingly procedural. Target 1 neutralized, Target 2 igniting, Target 3 venting. Even the language of war had become mechanized, emotion stripped away, precision in its place. When the tanks reached the central complex known as Position Gamma, they encountered the last organized resistance. Hidden within reinforced chambers, roughly 400 Japanese soldiers prepared for a final counterattack. As the tanks approached, they opened fire with anti-tank rifles and satchel charges, striking one Sherman squarely on the turret. The blast ripped open a fuel line, sending liquid napalm cascading down the hull. Crewmen inside scrambled out as their vehicle turned into a fireball, the first and only flamethrower tank lost that day. It exploded moments later, the heat so intense it fused volcanic sand into glass. Instead of retreating, the remaining tanks formed a semicircle and fired simultaneously into the bunker network. Witnesses said the flames joined mid-air, forming what looked like a wall of light. Within 15 minutes, the resistance at Position Gamma ceased. Marine engineers moved in wearing asbestos gloves, sealing tunnel entrances with explosives. The battle for Iwo Jima's ridges was over. The moment marked the final turning point of the campaign. The Japanese command's radio transmissions, once frequent and defiant, went silent. By March 16th, General Kuribayashi himself was dead, having led his final night assault armed only with a pistol. For American forces, victory was absolute, but its nature was unsettling. There had been no surrender, no flag of truce, only the quiet crackle of cooling steel. In Washington, military planners studying reports from the field recognized what these machines represented: a prototype for post-war mechanized assault. The combination of armor, fuel, and psychological warfare had proved devastating. The Office of Research and Development immediately began documenting data from the Iwo Jima campaign for application to the next invasion, Okinawa, and potentially Japan itself. Yet within those same reports lay warnings. Officers noted that while the flamethrower tank achieved unprecedented results, its use carried what they termed moral hazard of perception. Civilians exposed to such weapons might never again view warfare as a contest between soldiers but as industrial annihilation. It was a sobering realization. one that foreshadowed the ethical debates to come when America would unleash even greater forces later that year. As dusk fell on the island, the last flamethrower crews shut down their engines. Their vehicles were blackened, their armor pitted by heat. But they had accomplished the impossible, breaching a fortress the Japanese had sworn could never fall. Marines climbed the ridges now littered with twisted metal and stone. One of them, Corporal Henry Webb, looked across the horizon and said quietly, "This isn't victory. This is invention." His words, captured in a correspondence notebook, summarized the strange duality of that moment: triumph through technology, but victory stripped of glory. The turning point of Iwo Jima proved one thing above all: America had mastered the art of transforming ideas into dominance. What began as an engineer's blueprint in a Hawaiian workshop had reshaped the very nature of combat. And from that day forward, the roar of the flamethrower tank echoed far beyond the Pacific, as both a testament to human ingenuity and a warning of its consequences. When the fires finally went out on Iwo Jima, the Marines discovered a silence unlike any other in the Pacific War. The island that had shaken beneath the thunder of artillery now steamed like a forge. The concrete that once defined Japanese invincibility had melted into gray glass. Engineers moved through the ruins with clipboards and tape measures, noting how the flame had folded steel, how oxygen had vanished from tunnels. It was less a battlefield than an open laboratory, evidence that technology, not manpower, now dictated survival. In the weeks that followed, U.S. command teams filed technical reports instead of victory speeches. They recorded flame temperatures, fuel-to-pressure ratios, and the time required to clear each bunker system. These details fed directly into planning for Okinawa, where more flame tanks would deploy, refined with thicker armor and longer range. What had been an experiment at Iwo Jima was becoming doctrine. To Allied engineers, the lesson was mathematical. Any fortress, no matter how sacred, could be reduced given enough chemistry, steel, and patience. To the men who watched it happen, the lesson was more haunting. There was no longer a safe distance between invention and destruction. For Japan, the psychological toll was catastrophic. Survivor testimonies that reached the mainland described machines breathing fire and tunnels turned to ovens. Tokyo's military analysts tried to downplay them as exaggeration, but privately, they grasped the truth. No defense built by human hands could stand against an enemy that treated war as engineering. When U.S. reconnaissance photos later showed rows of flame tanks assembling for Okinawa, the reaction inside Japan's war ministry was despair, not anger. They had built a warrior culture. The Americans had built a system. The flamethrower tank soon became a symbol inside the U.S. military of problem-solving under pressure. Its operators were celebrated in training manuals but rarely in headlines. They were too closely associated with the terrible intimacy of their weapon, heroes without parades. When they returned home, many refused to speak about what they had seen. "Fire doesn't leave pictures," one veteran said. "It erases them." In Washington, the strategic consequences extended far beyond the Pacific. The success of mechanized fire projected forward into every post-war plan: napalm jets, demolition charges, atomic ordnance. The logic was the same. If destruction could be engineered, it could also be optimized. Historians would later call Iwo Jima the bridge between the industrial and nuclear ages, a moment when man learned to make the elements themselves obey command. Yet amid all the metrics and milestones, a quieter legacy endured. The same Seabees and engineers who had designed flame tanks also built field hospitals and desalination plants in the months after the battle. The duality was unmistakable. The Silki mind that burned bunkers was also the mind that purified water. Technology, stripped of intent, was neither mercy nor cruelty. It was capacity. What nations chose to do with it defined the century that followed. On Iwo Jima, a small plaque now stands where the last flamethrower tank ceased firing. It reads simply, "Here ingenuity met endurance." Beneath those words lies the essence of that chapter of history. For the Japanese soldiers entombed beneath the rock, it marked the end of an empire built on faith in human spirit alone. For the Americans who walked away, it marked the beginning of an age where progress would forever carry the weight of what it could destroy. The fire that melted concrete in seconds did more than win a battle. It forged a truth the world has lived with ever since, that mastery of matter can eclipse mastery of men, and that victory, once measured in courage, would henceforth be measured in invention.